Vasudevendra Yogendram Natva Jnana-pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitarthaya Tattvabodho Bhidiyate Atmakaha. So the question is, what's the essence of I am? And I thought that Tattva Bodha is redoing, reteaching of chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. And if you think about the context of the Gita, and I thought I'm going to start out like this because the connection is quite relevant. It's relevant for us. So if we look at chapter 1 of the Bhagavad Gita, we have Arjuna, who is Arjuna's predicament. Arjuna's predicament. And it starts out as what Arjuna is, who has to handle what he is confronted with. He has to handle his unique or her unique situation. And he doesn't know what to do, right? This is a challenge. It's the world throws challenges at us, and we have to find the best way to deal with them, to navigate day-to-day challenges that we go through. And there are many. Everyone has a different, right? Things happen to all of us, and they are unique opportunities presented to us to think differently. But in Arjuna's case, he was confronted with such a large predicament that he didn't know what to do, right? He was stuck. So this is this feeling in life of being stuck, right? This is happening, and I know the knowledge is there, but I feel stuck. So on one hand, there is knowledge of who and what you are. In Arjuna's case, it was different. He didn't know yet. But even if you do have the knowledge, one can still feel confronted. And the question then begs is, what do I do? Right? What's the best way to handle this, to minimize damage and to maximize the sort of a win-win, so that we're both having a profitable endeavor, a profitable time, so that there's a well-being on both sides. So Arjuna, his mind was confused, right? He didn't know how to handle. He was traumatized in his way, right? So we're not making this about Arjuna, by the way. We're just using the story to sort of relate to something. And the Gita is, in this manner, a universal book for everyone. And he didn't know what to think, and he was traumatized. And he says, my hands are shaking. Now, in our modern age, we don't necessarily have our hands shaking. We may be sweating, or we may be hot, or we may be kind of stifled. We don't know what to do. So it can manifest in different forms of physiological conditions. We get hot under the collar. We start to speak kind of broken voice. So all of these physical are indicators of a disturbed mind, a mind that has to to resolve something. And in this moment, Arjuna, when he needed most, asked for help. And so he called on Krishna, and he said to Krishna, you see, my problem is not only just a situational endeavor, okay? A situational endeavor is certainly there. I am confronted with this battle, and we're not speaking now about an external battle. We're bringing this to ourselves. It's an inner turmoil, right? What to do? Am I doing the right thing? And how do I know if I've done the right thing? right? So it's an internal conflict that Arjuna is undergoing. And he asks Krishna and says, see, not only am I asking for help as to what to do, right, situationally, but I'm not able to figure out what is that bigger vision that is guiding my life for fulfillment, that underlies all of my smaller attempts for fulfillment. What is that big vision that I sort of know about, but I can't quite put my finger on it? It guides my life. It drives my attempts for happiness. I don't know what it is. And then chapter 2 comes up. And Krishna says to Arjuna, he reveals to Arjuna's reality. And he says, you're not the small suffering human being, struggling small suffering human being. You're the whole. And and Arjuna hears this, and he says, Krishna says to him, as long as your fulfillment, is put into small things, small limited endeavors, like, such as kind of like solving the war, going into war, solving this situational problem, then what's going to happen? Something else will arise, right? So then again, it will be the same kind of, predicament. It will be the same endeavor for discovering a solution. So Krishna says to him, as long as until you own up to your truth, to the final reality, this fulfillment will be elusive. This endeavor for looking for this being permanently settled, right? It will remain elusive. For example, no matter how compassionate you become, or suppose you go and do some, works like charity and start to help, no matter how much you do, right, there still remains one fundamental, unresolved, unspoken voice, which says, I am still a mortal. Right? I'm a little dot in this universe. One day I will cease to exist. And so this unspoken, usually unbrought up predicament guides the individual as a form of compensation to look for smaller forms of fulfillment. So it ends up being an endeavor, one endeavor after another, to discover this sense of fullness in oneself. And Krishna says to him, until you discover your fullness as Nityam Brahman, which is unborn, and because it is unborn, it cannot die, because whatever is born, it dies, right? And it ages. But because your nature is unborn, it by definition cannot die, because nothing was born, therefore there's no one to die. It is limitless, but it's also changeless. That is your reality, says Krishna. Limitless and changeless, which means that it not only is full, but it is changelessly full, right? So it's never sort of subject to less or more. It is already full, maximum. It's already limitless. Your nature is already limitless. But not only is it limitless, it's also, changeless. So it will never, and it cannot be by definition 1% less tomorrow, or it's sort of more today than it is tomorrow. So whatever is full, it means by definition it cannot change, because what changes, then that means it's either less than it was yesterday, So whatever is full is changeless. And so Krishna says to Arjuna, what your concern is for these bodies, for your grandsire and for your teacher Drona and for all of your friends on the other side. So your predicament is in the light of where your focus is, where your mind is. So it is not the bodies that, right? The bodies go, the mind, right? The thoughts go. Thoughts go all the time. The bodies are decaying constantly. However, your nature is it's not only full, but it's already limitlessly full. It cannot be more or less. And so Arjuna, hearing this, he thought this was too big, right? It's such a big thing to hear. It's too much for me. And this is understandable because if you think about someone who is in a predicament and you give him this knowledge and you reveal the universe and that which is subtler than space and meanwhile the person's mind is on, in case of Arjuna, on society, right? What's going to happen to the widows? We're going to have so many soldiers who will no longer be fathers or husbands, and we will have widows in the society. And what's going to happen with the moral code, when wives are, without a man to protect them at those times, which then there will be suspect to promiscuity, and all of these thoughts, in Arjuna's case, in Arjuna's situation, were valid. Now, in our thoughts, it's always going to be different. I'm not saying this is going to be your thought. Your thought will be different. So Arjuna was not ready to hear this, and then he provided a reason why. And he was, from his standpoint of where he was at, he was absolutely right. So Krishna didn't dismiss that, right? He recognized that Arjuna's mind is not entirely fine-tuned to, right, hear the complete teaching because it's not quite relevant to Arjuna at that moment. So then Krishna asked the second question, and that is, then how do I, help Arjuna's mind to capture this reality? Because the highest purpose is the knowledge. That is the highest purpose of the Vedic vision. And everything else that follows it's a preparation for this knowledge to take place. So the preparation in Krishna's case, he recommended Arjuna, right, karma yoga. Now, we didn't do karma yoga in this book. We did, right, sixfold virtues. We did Shama and Dama. Shama, we said, was, being going from impulsive behavior, slowing down and taking a moment to look at one's words, one's sort of behaviors and responses, and look at one's orientations. How is one conducting themselves in everyday challenges, right? Because every opportunity, right? Every chance, every situation is given an opportunity to look at, how your mind is in response to challenges. And so every situation, by definition, becomes your something to work with, an opportunity to look in the mind, to ready the mind for the knowledge. Because in Arjuna's case, his mind was still going on with a narrative, right? A story. He was telling himself a story that sounded very real and persuasive. And we're very good at that. We'll create persuasive stories and we tell ourselves this story and we add details to this story to make it more real. So Arjuna was doing this. So when Krishna recommended him this practice, in our case, Shama and Dhamma, Shama being looking at one's orientations, and Dhamma being just mindful of one's physical environment, knowing that it can trigger these impulses, right? It can actually contribute to triggering one's sense of illness, one sense of impulsivity, one sense of sort of those mechanical and impulsive actions. So one can change, right, to the capacity that they're comfortable with, their physical environment, to not offer to the mind so much temptation to fall into its old patterns. So in that sense, Shama becomes and Dhamma becomes like karma yoga in our context that Krishna recommended to Arjuna. So knowing that this mind, right, needs ongoing preparation, which is not something that happens overnight. Where do you think we are now in the Tattva Bodha across chapter 1, 2, and 3? Which chapter do you think we are in now? Chapter 2, right? Chapter 2 in the Gita deals with the knowledge. And Tattva Bodha is really chapter 2, right? It's just condensed version of chapter 2. Now, suppose after the Tattva Bodha text, you say, I've heard the knowledge, but I connected, and we're not saying, you're not going to quite connect. We all connect at some parts, and some parts we don't. Suppose you hear the teaching, and then you say, you're not kind of like touched by it. Then what do we do, right? What does Krishna recommend? It says, right, now knowing that the highest purpose is knowledge, understanding who I am and who I am not, right? But it's more so who I am not, because we already know who we are. Everyone knows that already. Should that knowledge not take place, or it's sort of, it's partial, then what happens? Knowing that now that the highest purpose is knowledge, then I make my life in such a way that everything becomes a means for an end, right? It's not like, things are not, put attention. There's attention, but everything gains a different purpose, because the life purpose is now taking care of your mind so that the knowledge can slowly be, planted. The seeds have a cultivated mind to be planted in. Okay, so we can see the order, right, of the Gita, which it's quite similar to Tattva Bodha. And so now, when Arjuna, what was Arjuna asking? How do I gain that fulfillment, which is guiding my life? Which is guiding my life for all mini fulfillments, small fulfillments. What is that underlining fulfillment? And then last week we said, to bring it back to the Tattva Bodha, is you have to understand, right, this Sat and Chit and Ananda. And we said that these are the 3 words minimum for helping us to have some clarity about, right, who am I, right? What is my truth? And we stopped on the word Ananda, and we said this Ananda tends to confuse. In fact, it's the most confusing word in this entire teaching, because we said it has 2 definitions. And the first definition is limitless or fullness, whereas the second definition is a more common transactional definition, which is what they call bliss, right, or happiness. Now, suppose that, right, your vision is on number 2, then what's going to happen is one's going to end up being a constant seeker, right? Because how many times do you need to get happiness until you say, okay, now I finished getting happiness. I don't want happiness anymore. Does anyone say that? No one says that, right? I'm tired of getting happiness. It's going to be the same old thing that I've already had. I don't need happiness anymore. So this is not going to happen because as long as the focus is on definition number 2, that means transactional moments of happiness, then it's going to be this sort of, I need to look for something in this world to fill me up, right? However, in truth, because the problem is the I is placed in that which cannot be filled up, which is either the body or the mind, then no matter how much you fill the body and the mind, see, the question then comes in, how much do you need to fill it up until, again, you say, enough is enough? That cannot happen, and that will never happen, because by definition, the mind that is happy now won't be there 5 minutes from now. So you've only enjoyed that mind that was in moment of time, but because the mind changes, everything that happened 5 minutes ago no longer applies right now. So from the standpoint of right now, I want to fill this mind up again with happiness. And then it's going to have the same story. It's the same going to be with the physical body. So this means when this I, which wants to be happy, is placed in that which is passing in time, then by definition, it is going to be bound by time, right? So this means we have to shift, right? This is the purpose of the Tattva Bodha, to shift the I to definition 1, which is fullness. But then we ask, what do you mean by shift? Like, what does shifting mean? See, if I ask you, for example, can you shift your I to transactional happiness? Yes. Okay. That means, you have some joke, you hear a joke, you hear some experience, and you're happy, right? So this is what we're all experts at. We shift our I onto relative happiness, right? But when I say relative happiness, what are we talking about? We're talking about an experience, right? It's a sensation, an emotion. We call it a happy thought. I've had a happy thought. And the I, right, Atman, identified with that happy thought. And what happened? I took that happy thought as an object to be gained once more so that I can fill myself up. But because the I has not looked into its nature, right, which is already full, definition number 1, fullness, then whatever it does, it's actually, right, it's actually not touching itself at all. It's actually addressing the person. It's giving, it's kind of like there for the person to gain some happiness at the expense of completely ignoring itself. So when we say shift focus, right, onto that which is already full, right, how do I do this? How do you think? How do you shift? Because see, what's going to shift focus? The mind's going to shift focus, right? But then we have but then am I the mind? No, right? So what exactly is going to shift focus if is it going to be the mind alone that shifts focus? No, because the mind, right, needs I, right? We call this the subject. We talked about the subject last week. So the subject is the one that shifts the focus. This subject, right? How do you shift focus? By understanding cognitively that the nature of I is always fullness. See, cognitive understanding is something that you can own. Just like I can own 1 + 1 = 2. Tomorrow, 1 + 1 is also going to be 2. 50 years from now, 1 + 1 is going to be 2. It's never going to change. In that same manner, right, to cognitively own fullness means I understand even if, right, there's this constant, like there's a person, right? There's a person who is experiencing happiness, who has moments of happiness. Even if there's this person there, right? From what is this happiness arising from? From where is it coming from? It's coming from that which is always full. Okay. And this fullness, which is always full, that I can cognitively own. Whereas if to own definition number 2, which is experiential happiness, what's going to happen? There's going to be, this constant struggle for something, right? Something new to come into my life. Therefore, when we talk about this ananda, right? When we talk about definition number 2 now, happiness, transactional happiness, what the book wants to say is, rather than using this thought bubble, right? Thought bubble of happiness, and sort of going, I want that one more time, by repeating the experience, which is nothing wrong with that, by the way. In fact, if you didn't, then would go insane. This is called, balancing life. This is just living a relatively cheerful, responsible, noble life. That is what naturally, will produce this happiness. But this happiness is, what is it? It is to be understood. That is, a glimpse of my fullness. That is a manifestation of I. That is a manifestation of I, which is full. So rather than turning it into another object of desire, rather look at it, one looks at it as a teaching tool, as an inspiration, that this happiness is not coming from the object, it's not coming from a place, it's not coming from time, it's not coming from the mind. As we analyzed last week, it is arising from none other than myself. And even if this happiness is no longer true, when happiness or cheerfulness goes away, it doesn't in any way displace me. It doesn't displace my fullness. Now, how do you understand this? Cognitively, one owns up that even if this experiential happiness is not in my life, there still remains a present, existent, awareful I, whose nature is fullness. And for the time being, because there's no happy thought form in the mind, happiness is not felt, it's not experienced, but it doesn't define or displace or take away my nature. Therefore, the wise person's focus always goes back onto a cognitive understanding that despite the presence of cheerfulness, I am still fullness. And cheerfulness may come tomorrow. It may come from, a month from now. It may come with a conversation that I have, a joke or a movie that you hear, and whatever happiness or degrees of happiness that form, manifests in the mind. It is giving you a glimpse of yourself with which I can appreciate my direct nature. Okay, so you see the difference between definition number 2 and experience, which cannot be sustained because it's being sustained in a very instrument that itself is going through changes called the mind. Therefore, no experience can be sustained. Why not? Very important to understand, because every experience is occurring in an instrument that is bound by time. Whatever is bound by time, by definition, cannot stay like that forever. It will inevitably change into a different form. But even if it does, cognitively, I understand it does not displace or move me or take away my fullness. Okay, so we have so far looked at 3 words, Sat and Chit and Ananda. And so now, see, if we look at our experience, right, direct experience, how is it that we can kind of universally all relate with? What is it that we're all universally want? If you kind of ask anyone in this world. You ask someone in Africa, someone in India, you ask someone in Antarctica, you ask someone in Europe, in China, and you say, what everyone wants is to live. Yeah? Yeah, so we all want to exist. We all want sat. So this sat, right? Sat chit manifests as what? At the level of the person. I want to live. Nobody wants to die today. We all want to die when? We all want to die tomorrow. But when tomorrow comes, I don't want to die today. I want to die tomorrow. So in other words, everyone wants to live, but how? Live miserably? No, live happily. So we all want to live cheerfully, right? So we want sat and we want ananda. Now, do you want to live cheerfully? But is that possible if you are ignorant? If you know that there's so many things that you don't know, and it's just bothering you. Like, I just don't know. Suppose someone says something about you, right? And you're cheerful. You're cheerful and you want to live. And someone says something and they kind of turn their heads and they laugh at you. And you think they said something, some gossip. And you want to know, right? What happens to your cheerfulness and your, right? It just disappears, right? So not only do I want to live, I want to live cheerfully, and I don't want to be ignorant. I don't want to be ignorant about the universe, about the world, about people, about my behaviors, about my conditions, about why I do what I do. What can I do to, right, sort of, become a noble, responsible, cheerful, relatively satisfied human being. So we all want these three conditions, which are how Sat, Chit, and Ananda manifest themselves at the level of the human individual. Now, what happens sometimes is, see, in extreme cases, this need to live is so powerful that it's actually more powerful than living happy or not knowing. In fact, you could have a person who is, not kind of, they're not cheerful and they don't know very much, but they still want to live. But sometimes what happens is the possibility of living happily is so far away that the person's sort of, the pressure is there and it blocks the mind from seeing any form of hope in the future, any form of light, that the person simply, makes a decision and they say living further doesn't make sense. It's better to end my existence. So suicide, in this case, what happens is, yes, I want to live happily. I want to live, but I don't want to live, like a miserable human being. And so, so sometime when the pressure gets so hard, so much, so dark that the person cannot see a way out, then, they just end their life. In fact, the suicide hotlines, calling them up, what do they have? They have a prepared list of most tested statements, right, that are universal, that you can tell the individual, which kind of brings them, attempts to change their perspective just a little bit outside their narrow, hopeless view, to give them some light that there is some possibility for happiness. So this is what the suicide hotlines will do, because the person's mind is so covered that it cannot see any sense of living happily in the future. So this means their ananda is completely gone. Yeah. Okay. So sat and chit and ananda is what we are all seeking. All three of them, as we described, are minimum to reveal your direct svarupa, your direct nature. Okay. Now let's see what else it says here. Okay. So we also discussed briefly last week we looked at this happiness, and we brought two concepts or two teachings. We said a subject and an object. And we said, what is it that denies happiness for an ordinary person? We're not now talking, right, extreme suicidal cases, or we're just talking for an ordinary person whose focus is on the I, which despite its fullness, it keeps on putting its nature, its identity into that which cannot be full, which is never full, which is the body mind. So what happens, see, we have an object, and we have a subject. And the subject we're going to cover now very soon in the verses. We're going to talk about what's the subject made of. And we said that, this I, which is really just the whole board, right? Satin shit, right? The whole board, right? This I, right, Atma, pervades the whole, whatever object, pervades the object and pervades the subject. But I want to ask this, what's the difference between an inert object like this container, and because the subject is also an object, right? It's also, see, from my standpoint, you're an object to me, right? From your standpoint, I'm an object to you, right? So even the subject is an object. So the question is, what's the difference between an object and a subject, right? They're both objects. They're both existence, right? They both exist. We just start from simple, right? They both exist. Object exists, subject exists. Okay, so they both share sat, right? But does the object enjoy chit? Right? No. I mean, is this conscious? Is your table right now conscious? Like if you pinch your table, does a table pinch you back and goes, ow, stop? It doesn't do that. But if I pinch the subject, what's the subject going to do? Right? It's going to respond. So why is the subject responding? Because the subject enjoys another type of matter, right? If this is what we call, physical matter, right? Physical matter. And this is also matter. Your physical body is matter, but what kind of other form of matter does the subject enjoy? It enjoys a more reflective kind of matter, which we call the subtler matter. It is like a mirror. It's able to not only does it exist, but it's able to, as though, reflect, right? Like a mirror. If I hold a mirror, right, it is also matter, like a stone, but a stone does not reflect anything. What reflects? The mirror reflects. So the mirror has the capacity to reflect light, right? Suppose I shine light. It reflects light back and it shines the world. It shines up the world. So when we talk about the subject, all we're saying is this subject is it is that which has what's called a subtle body, right? A subtle body. It's just a subtler form of matter, which we call otherwise, in one word, the mind. Now, what happens is this subtle body has what we call desires, right? Beliefs, right? It has right? It has opinions, it has, right, orientations, it's got, it's got joys and sorrows, okay? It's got proclivities, inclinations, so many things it has. So what do you think happens to all of this, right? What happens to all of this? It gets owned. It gets owned by that one that is pervading it. And that is the one I, right? The one shit that is through and through this entire exist. Never mind the board. I'm talking about right now, right? That's pervading, right? Your mind right now. So when this, when this mind, right, is enlivened by consciousness, then it makes a claim and it says, I am, right? I am conscious, right? I am a knower. I am a knower. a knower. We said in Sanskrit, this is called pramata, right? Pramata. It doesn't matter. It's just a knower slash a subject. Okay, like that. Knower slash subject. So what happens when, someone is suppose, wants something? I want something. Why do I, I'm talking about this I, the I who takes themselves as a desire, as an inclination, as a, whatever, joys and sorrows, right? Why do I desire this? Why do I desire this? Because whoever this, I is, right? What is it that they lack that's making them desire this? What is it that they lack? Does a person lack that is making me desire an object, thinking that when that object is, sort of mine, when I can claim that object as mine, it's going to make me slightly bigger. Now I'm going to enjoy, myself, at least my image of myself, as slightly bigger, right? What is it that they lack? They lack, we said last week, that both, right, enjoy this sat, right, exists, and the subject, see, the mind also exists, right? Never mind that it's, subtler matter, gross matter, subtle matter, it both enjoys existence, right? Sat. And how is this existence expressed in the real world? We say it, whether we say it or not, we say it is, right? It is, right? Can you say container unless you imply it is, unless it enjoys some existence? Can you say that? Right? Container is. So you are including, whether you say it or not, you're including an aspect, you're acknowledging that something exists, whether you, say it explicitly or don't say it at all. But the subject, the wanter, also is, right? Right? The subject is, the subject exists. So we said last week that what makes one, what denies happiness is, see, the focus is on the difference aspect, on the difference. One is like this, one is like that, right? X, Y, and they're two different objects. So what we need, so what Tattva Bodha is showing us is that, they not only enjoy Sat Chit, but to understand a little bit better, actually, what this subject is, we need to then look into the nature of the subject, right? Because just to say that it exists, that is fine. In fact, that's how, that's the final understanding, right? But to help us understand the subject a little bit better, what is the verse going to say? It's going to say, what is the question? Atma kaha, right? What is Atma? And it says, Atma, other than the three bodies. So this means if I am to know without a doubt what is the nature of I, without a doubt, I mean clear as daylight, as clear as the last verse will say, for an unwise person, they're convinced that I am a man, I am a brahmana, I am a woman. Equally, for a wise person, they are like that, equally convinced, I am, right? I am Sat Chit, I am not a man, I am not a woman, I am not, right? All of this. But to understand that, what the book wants to do is talk about these three bodies, okay? And these three bodies is something that we all carry with us, okay? Why do we carry these three bodies? It is to work out our stuff. So, now you're using one of your all three bodies to kind of listen to this. And by, your three bodies, what are we using the three bodies for? To understand what the three bodies are. So we need the three bodies to understand the three bodies, and therefore to see that I am other than the three bodies. So now, so that I do not place, right, myself in those three bodies. That's why we need the three bodies. Now, this physical body, right, your tangible body that we use to kind of, work out our stuff. It is made alive by our subtle body, our mind. Now, what is your subtle body? Subtle body is what enlivens your physical body. So your physical body is not just kind of flapping its hands, randomly and doing things that don't make sense. If you look at any physical body, you will see that it carries itself with an order. There's an order there. There's an intelligence moving the physical body. The physical body is responding intelligently to what the physical body is presented to, right? So that intelligence, that the governor, right, of this physical body is what we call the subtle. So what is the subtle body? It is what we call the indweller. What is an indweller? Indweller, for example, I go to your house and I knock on your door and nobody answers. Your physical house is there, but nobody answers. Why not? Because the indweller is not in the house. The house without the indweller is just, it's good as, well, you can't do anything with it. Nothing happens there. But suppose now the indweller is sort of, snoozing away, and you go over to someone and you knock on their body. Their body is kind of sleeping in bed, and you knock on their physical body and nobody's home, and you knock a little bit harder. You want to invoke the indweller, and after some struggle, the indweller returns. You've seen this on the trains, right? When someone's drunk and they keep on knocking on them over and over, and the indweller returns, and the physical body starts to show some signs of intelligence, if at any at all, that moment, right? So the indweller has returned back. But then suppose you keep on knocking and nobody's answering the door. Nobody's answering the face. Nobody's answering the hands. Nobody's answering the eyebrows or the mouth. And then you kind of move closer, and we see that this person is not breathing. And we call quickly emergency. We call over the doctor, the emergency hotline. They come over and they said, well, they're gone. You see, what do you mean they're gone? Well, the person, they're gone. No, but they're not gone. I can see the physical body there. It's lying. I can touch it. I can, I can feel it. Well, the physical body is there, but the indweller, right, is gone. The indweller has left the house. The house is no longer occupied by this intelligent indweller who was there only moments ago. They have gone. Where have they gone? This is a conversation for the Vedas. I don't know where they're gone, but they're gone. Okay, so the physical body is there, but there is also the indweller of the physical body. And then we have, the question now is, what gave birth to the what manifested this mind, this physical body, but also what manifested the subtle body? And it says the causal body, right? The karana sharira. So let's look at the word causal, because see, what does causal mean, right? It means something that causes. It causes the other two bodies. The causal body, the karana sharira, causes the other two bodies. But then you say, how, right? What do you mean it causes the other two bodies? Let me ask you this question, okay, before we answer this directly. When a person is born, when I say jiva means a living being, just a living being, literally a living being. When a jiva is born, does the jiva have knowledge of anything except the basics like breathing and, the natural program is there for ethics, but does it have basic knowledge of language, of walking, of communicating, of eating. Does it have knowledge of any of that? Did you ever see any baby that's born and it just magically knew more than its mother? It just rejected its mother's help and it just did it by itself. Like, no, I don't need you. I can walk over to the fridge and have milk. I can figure this out on my own. Yeah. And suppose we say, well, that's because the baby doesn't have the right maturity. Okay, well, you leave the baby alone and you just supply it milk, right? And you don't teach it anything. Is it going to magically discover, right, on its own, as it grows up into an adulthood, and suddenly just walk into the cockpit and just start flying an airplane, right? I know how to move these buttons around. I know what the throttle is for. I know airspeed. I know velocity. I know what trajectory, what heading to set. I know all this, right? And you put it in front of a computer and it just magically knows how to open up Adobe Photoshop and start to do some mock-ups and create some 3D models and create a program in JavaScript and Python. And then you put it in the kitchen and you just sit down at a table and it brings back the most incredible meal you've ever had in your life, right? It knows just exactly what to do, how to do it, when to do it. It's just amazing, amazing child. Yeah, maybe it does exist. We call them what? There's a special name for this, right? They always imagine.
Prodigy.
Prodigy, right? Yeah. The special children, oh, my child is the next Buddha. My child's going to figure it all out. It's just projection. But besides the point. So a jiva is born not knowing, unknowledgeable, ignorance. Can we say that? Ignorance. Jiva is born ignorant. Ignorant means other than knowledgeable. It doesn't know. Okay. So if jiva, including this jiva, right? Living entity in this case, living entity. If a jiva is born out of ignorance, how do we know it's born out of ignorance? Because the fact that the child says, I don't know, that alone is the proof showing that it's born out of ignorance and not knowledge. Yes, it does have relative knowledge in terms of how to breathe, how to sort of, call mommy, how to grab onto her skirt and draw her attention. It does have that, but that's called inbuilt. It's an inbuilt program for basic survival, basic capacity to think, to emote. Of course, you still have to feed it knowledge, but until you feed it, it's just going to remain unutilized, unused, therefore ignorance. Okay. So if the jiva, if you and I, let's make this more personal, is born out of ignorance, then when did ignorance get born? When was ignorance born? If the jiva was born out of ignorance, then when was ignorance born? When was the first time ignorance came?
It never did.
Okay, it never did. Now we have to bring an understanding to this. Why can you say that ignorance was never born? Because suppose you say ignorance was born at some point in time. What is the problem making this statement? You can only say that ignorance is born if either ignorance was born out of nothing, right? There was not, once upon a time, there was nothing, neither ignorance, neither knowledge. And out of that nothing was born ignorance. Is that logically possible? Nothing. I mean, neither ignorance, neither knowledge, nothing. And out of nothing, ignorance was born. Ignorance, like I don't know, came out of nothing.
It can't happen. It's not logical.
Yeah, it's not logical. It cannot happen. Right? There's a cause-effect relationship that has to come from something. Ignorance cannot come from nothing. That's option one. Option two is to say that ignorance came out of knowledge. Okay, now think about this. So knowledge, there's knowledge, right? Knowledge. I know how to drive a car, for example. Just make it more kind of easy to grasp. I know how to drive a car. That's knowledge. Out of this knowledge of knowing how to drive a car, what comes out? Ignorance of not knowing how to drive a car. Is that possible? Suppose there's all knowledge. I mean, all knowledge. Knowledge doesn't lack anything. It's just knowledge, blueprint of all things, how things are to work, why they work, knowledge of Spanish, knowledge of Hindi, knowledge of Sanskrit, knowledge of English, knowledge of how the planets are put together, knowledge of gravity, how far the sun is to be from the moon, knowledge of how in nature laws are to operate together to make this huge complex universe work as it is right now. Jasmine, I know you have a hand up. There is total, you don't? Okay. There is total knowledge of all things. That means nothing is missing. There is nothing that is not known. And out of that knowledge comes ignorance. Is that possible? No. No. I hope you said no. If you think about this, it requires some thinking. Out of total knowledge, right? Okay, right now, I want you to suddenly have ignorance of walking. Please begin ignorance of walking. Come on. Begin from now on. I want you to be ignorant of, I want you to have ignorance born from now on of how to walk. I want walking ignorance to be born from now on. Yes, Robert.
Only if there was a capacity to either veil or forget that knowledge.
Yes, so we're not now, yeah, good. So what Robert is saying is if there is a capacity like of the mind, suppose, amnesia or dementia, or in that case, there is ability to suddenly, forget your own name. But we're not talking about, mental conditions. We're talking about from all knowledge, right? All knowledge, which knows about everything. And from that, ignorance is suddenly born. So ignorance cannot be born from nothing. It cannot be born from knowledge. Then what's the only other explanation? If ignorance was never born, right, and you and I are born out of ignorance, and ignorance was never born, then what is that? What's the only other explanation?
There is no ignorance.
Huh?
There is no ignorance.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, there is ignorance because I clearly don't know how to say, hello in, Japanese.
It's beginningless.
It's beginningless. So what's the only other option? If ignorance cannot be born from knowledge or nothing, is ignorance was there all along. There's no question of ignorance suddenly popping up. There was once upon a time a knowledge, it was all perfect. You hear this sometimes, right? In some models. And suddenly, right, I decided to be ignorant, right? I decided to become ignorant once upon a time because I was so kind of bored being, knowledgeable. And so I just wanted to be ignorant once upon a time. That is an impossibility. The only explanation is ignorance was there all along. Okay. Now, you see, now I can bring this Maya, right? Veiling capacity, but we haven't discussed Maya right now. So it was there all along. So if the Jiva is born out of ignorance and ignorance was there all along, then how long has the Jiva been? Same answer. As long as, right, Nagesh? As long as ignorance was there, the Jiva was there. So how many times then, by definition, were you born? You can't say this life only, because we just said ignorance cannot begin until I remove ignorance, until I, shift focus from my I being in that which gives, that which produces my subtle and physical body, I move it onto that which is full, which is, right, never under any form of conditions of ignorance, not under the form of any kind of not knowing, not subject to not knowing. So only when I move my focus away from that, right, then I become free of that which produces the physical and the subtle body. Okay. See, if ignorance is beginningless, right, it's anadi, it never began. So then the objection you can say now, well, then I can't remove it, right? If it's beginningless, then how am I supposed to remove it? Well, because ignorance, in our experience, right, is that which can be removed. Ignorance is also dependent upon a conscious subject. So as long as I don't know, ignorance remains. When I do know, what happens when you do learn, right, finally how to say hello in a different language, do you still have ignorance of that word? No. Ignorance relative to that one word is gone. So when I remove my ignorance, right, relative to the nature of I, then from that moment, right, I am no longer subject to identifying with that which is always kind of, going through different modifications. Okay, so ignorance itself, yes, it is beginningless, but does this mean it is endless? No, it has the capacity to keep on going forever until I remove it. Therefore, you cannot say that ignorance is, yes, it is beginningless, but you cannot say that ignorance cannot end, because it clearly can end, because it does depend on, the subject I, and also it can be removed by understanding my real nature. So this means it can go on forever until, right, I look deeper into the nature, and then I, discover that, I'm much bigger than this, this sort of a small person. It's going to say the causal body is called ignorance. Now, why do you think the causal body is called ignorance? Because it's what causes, right? It's what causes the subtle and the physical body. And what causes the subtle and the physical body? Ignorance. Therefore, whatever this cause is ignorance, which is why the causal body, karana sharira, is called ignorance. So when we, suppose we say in the waking state right now, suppose I say to you, okay, I'm going to ask you a question. What is, how far is Earth from the sun? Okay, your answer is, and I don't know too, right? The answer is, I don't know, right? I don't know, right? So when we say I don't know, where is the I being placed now? Suppose, oh, I don't know. Oh my God, I don't know anything. I need to learn. I need to go and find out on Google. So what happened now, right? The I, right, which is already full, right, has identified with the causal body. The causal body, which is of the nature of ignorance. And so then it now again pursues the world in order to know a little bit, just that much. Right? So whenever we say I don't know, then this I is directly identified with this causal body. Because the causal body is, it's that which is limited. It's only giving you limited amount of information. So causal body can be understood as limited amount of information. If the total causal body, which Robert has said the word Maya, we can say Maya, we will talk about this. If Maya is the total causal body that gives birth to this whole universe, stars and planets and laws and orders and ethics and what every person's life, how every person's life is to unfold, and when certain things in your body will come up. For some of us, there's an illness that just comes out unexpectedly, and then it's sort of it heals, right? Whatever is to unfold for every individual, what is to come tomorrow, right? What is to come next cycle, all of the causes and all of the connections, we can call this is the total causal body of the universe. Out of that total, we have a minuscule assigned to each individual. That minuscule obviously is not going to have the total, it's going to have limited, right? It's going to have a limited amount of, right, knowledge. That limited is called your causal body. So what is your causal body? Your causal body is a minuscule of the total causal body, which is why you and I don't know everything. What knows everything? The total causal, that from which the entire universe comes. So everything that comes, every jiva, every living being, including you, is just one tiny aspect of this total causal, which has been here since time immemorial. There was never a time when it was not. So because there was never a time when the total was not, there was never a time when you were not. There was never a time when you were not as a physical and subtle body. So how long were you and I here? Since time immemorial. Cycles upon cycles upon cycles of creation. Why? Because the total causal was there, beginningless, and therefore the micro, your and I causal, was also there since beginningless time. Are you ignorance? Suppose you say, I don't know. That question, how far is Earth from the sun? And you say, I don't know. Therefore, I'm ignorant. Are you ignorance? If you were ignorance, right? Suppose you were ignorance, then why would you make that statement, right? Why would you say that you don't know if you were ignorance? Because that is who you would be. There will be no question of, saying I don't know. If you were ignorance, right? How would you know, right? How would you know that there is ignorance? How would you know that you don't know how far is the earth from the sun if you were ignorance? So in other words, I know that I don't know. You understand? I know that I don't know. I'm aware that I don't know a certain fact, which means that even ignorance has not covered me, has not covered Sat and Chit, has not covered Atma. Therefore, what it says is Sthula, physical, right? Sukshma, subtle, and Karana, causal. Vyatiriktaha. So therefore, Atma is distinct from these three bodies. These three, we can call them superimpositions, these three modifications. And what are these three modifications specifically? Like if we were to look into the anatomy, not to kind of know what the body is made of, but just to inform us a little bit more, what is this physical body, subtle body, and causal body, so that we don't keep on putting this I into it. What is the nature of them? What are their characteristics? Then this will be unfolded next week. We have concluded the verse, Atma Kaha, Sthula, Sukshma, Karana, Sharira, Vyatiriktaha. So Atma is other than the three bodies. It is distinct from Pancha Kosha. This is just a different model of the three bodies. Avastha Traya Sakshi. So Atma is the presence in whom the three states are occurring, the witness of the three states. What is the direct nature of Atma? So if all of this I am not, then who and what am I? Sat and Chit and Ananda. Yas tishtati sa Atma. That is Atma. All right. So next verse is just going to now cover like what is the physical body, what is the subtle body, what is the causal body, and then it's going to go into the details of each one.
Can't really grasp this beginningless ignorance, because doesn't that introduce a paradox? Brahman is all-knowing, all-encompassing. With that, how can Brahman has a beginningless ignorance?
Only at the individual basis there is ignorance. Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Avashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.